Hello, everyone. And this next week, we're going to really focus on chapters 21 and 26. We're jumping ahead and out of order in terms of just following the normal timeline for chapters 1, 2, 3, 4. But I felt in reviewing these two, chapter 21 and 26 truly do go together really well. So we're going to be looking at problems faced by diverse populations and then social problems that are coming up in the 21st century and some that we see already as well. So within this part of your textbook, the author talks quite a bit about how we know discrimination is still alive and well. And I truly don't recall a time in our history or me having grown up in America that we are seeing such um, discrimination in ways that are more blatant and more pronounced. And I have young children. I think I've talked about that in my introduction, but they are looking at outward displays of discrimination in ways that I hadn't in my day when I was their age, kind of back in the 1980s. So I think it's important that we do really talk about discrimination in a very open way. I've heard some kind of concerning comments from students in the past that, talking about these issues of racial inequality makes them uncomfortable. And I think that that is in itself a statement that really shows that some people are just not aware of what types of discrimination go on, because this is an uncomfortable conversation, and it can be, but it's also something that is real and happens to people every day. So we are going to focus in on specific issues of hate crimes, and as future social workers, you're going to be exposed to individuals who have not only experienced this, but has impacted how they live their life day to day. And some of you in the class may have your own experiences with discrimination and hate crimes, especially as it relates to racial profiling or some of these other aspects that we're going to be talking about. So we can see, if just in comparing how these hate crimes have been increasing over the years, there's a lot of statistics that state that this is increasing. And although recently we've heard of more organized type of hate groups, I want to focus in here on this statistic that states that fewer than 5% of offenders of hate crimes or discrimination are not members, or actually fewer than 5% are members of organized hate groups. So if you think about that, 95 to 96% of individuals are offenders and do perpetrate hate crimes, but they are not part of an organized group. So these are individuals walking out just in society, and so we really need to be aware and talk about this regardless of how uncomfortable it may be. So specifically, when we discuss hate crimes and we look at the different types of hate crimes that can occur, either specifically to ethnic minorities or potentially to individuals who identify as LGBT, Human Rights Watch groups indicate that there are more medical and research reports that LGBT individuals, they also experience very high levels of anti-gay harassment, abuse, and violence, but also ethnic minorities are often the victims of hate crimes because either they are considered new to the country or they're seen as different. And so I would urge you to think about that for a moment, because we have been a fairly inclusive country for many, many years. And as of recent, probably the quote unquote newest minority group may be those especially relating back to 9/11 in 2001, specifically individuals who practice Muslim religion or are from some of those Muslim countries. But African American, Hispanic, Asian, Italian, individuals who are ethnic minorities in this country have been here for a very long time. And so it's very important that we identify what a hate crime is and really talk about some of these more widespread effects. As it states here, ethnic minorities are often the victims of anti-immigrant bias, which includes resentment when they succeed and anger when they act against established norms. Right now in our country, there's a large movement to really stop the influx and inflow of immigrants. And so if you think about that and really what our country was founded upon, I would urge you, regardless of what side you're on, is what is the basis for your concern and understanding? Is it lack of jobs for individuals who've lived in the country for a long time? Is there a displaced fear that maybe ethnic minorities who are coming in from other countries are quote unquote stealing jobs? It's very important to note that, because there are statistics that state that we are not in a decline of jobs because ethnic minorities are taking jobs. So often, unfortunately, individuals who perpetrate hate crimes are just severely, severely uneducated about some of the facts as it relates to ethnic minorities. As I mentioned, LGBT youth are, and actually LGBT individuals experience those high levels of harassment, and we're seeing that LGBT youth are at much greater risk than even the general population of risk for major depressions, generalized anxiety disorders, substance abuse, independent suicidal behavior, sexual risk-taking, poor general health maintenance. And so those are really the primary sources of stress in the lives of LGBT, is how they will be accepted in society. We, in the past 10 years, have seen great strides towards the increased acceptance of individuals who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. But again, we are seeing a kind of a resurge of some of those discrimination and hate crimes that are happening. There are reports that state that active homosexual and bisexual adolescents have higher rates of suicide attempts in the last year, up to 27%, compared to youth who are heterosexual, who are at 15% for suicide attempts. And we also are seeing that students with same-sex experience are significantly more likely to be threatened by a weapon. Again, really implicating some of those issues relating to health crimes. There's a branch of the National Institute of Mental Health that states that gay, lesbian, and bisexual youth experience more violence related behavior at school, and again, therefore also have higher rates of suicide attempt as well. There is something that is discussed in your textbook about some internal stressors, which includes internalized homophobia and the perception of a society that discriminates against gay people. And this really has to do with individuals who are self-identifying as LGBT really taking what they feel society's viewpoints are of them, those negative viewpoints, and turning it in on themselves and feeling as though that is something that they have to own, and it's something that they feel that they are not equal. And so that internalized homophobia is something that's really important for social workers, especially those who are working in the clinical fields, to really understand and accept. I feel it's really important, that section in your chapter that discusses laws governing discrimination, because again, back from 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, we are seeing that attempts, especially at a federal level, were really beginning to prohibit discrimination. And so we see that continuing even earlier than 1964 with 1963, the Equal Pay Act. However, we're still in 2017 discussing those gender inequalities as it relates to equal pay. The Age Discrimination Employment Act of 1967 that protects individuals who are 40 years of age or older from being discriminated against getting a job or even applying for a job. And then again, the American with Disabilities Act in 1990, which now we're talking roughly 20, almost 25 years later, that prohibits employment discrimination for those who may have a disability, which is really important because that does impact and give rights to those who need to be protected. And if we look at, again, some of those laws that were enacted, we see another Civil Rights Act of 1991, which again really provided monetary damages in those cases where individuals were being discriminated in the workplace. And now, even with our own CSWE that accredits our program in the social work department, we have to show that our college has an equal opportunity, employment opportunity, and even a discrimination policy and a plan in case there are charges or allusions to discrimination within our college as well. And kind of rounding out in the next 4 slides, we're going to talk a little bit about racial profiling. And we saw more, I wouldn't see an upsurge of racial profiling, but what we definitely saw was more of an understanding of what is racial profiling and how are we seeing this played out more on a national stage. So it's important to understand. Truly racial profiling is when individuals are targeted based on their attributes, be it skin color, their race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, that places qualities onto themselves that do not have any basis for any type of realistic actual fact as it relates to them. As it discusses here, even though the symptoms were the same for African American and Latino patients, they were often diagnosed as being either schizophrenic or having more severe mental illnesses, whereas white patients who were coming in to be treated were almost always correctly diagnosed with less serious emotional problems. So as a mental health therapist, for some of you who may want to be more macro and work one-on-one with patients, you have to be very self-aware of any bias that you may have and how that might impact your ability to properly diagnose someone. Again, we're seeing that individuals who are of an ethnic minority were oftentimes spent more time in the hospital in terms of psychiatric ward, but they may have been given lower privilege levels or given more medications just based on the fact that they were African American or Hispanic. If we look again at even within our own federal databases, the Surgeon General identifies that even though they're not the sole determinants, cultural and social influences do absolutely play important roles in mental health, mental illness, and service use when added on top of that to biological, psychological, and environmental factors. So I want you to consider this a moment, because as we try to understand those barriers in treating individuals, especially ethnic and racial minorities, we have to be very conscious that our mental health system is not creating certain blocks or barriers that may lead to mistrust or fear of treatment. And so then what we would see are individuals from different countries, different races, of different ethnic and racial groups not seeking treatment or seeking services because they do have a fear that they may be targeted and may be given additional treatments or charged additional treatments, different additional medications that they do not need, and which would be absolutely a problem. Pardon me. Just kind of continuing on with this, and this is a very small portion of what was actually in your textbook, but I think it's important that within your textbook there were several different reports that were provided that really talked about, in working with African American patients, the therapist's skill is to recognize when problems do or do not revolve around the condition of being Black, and that could have serious implications for the acceptability of treatment. If you feel that to ignore someone's racial identity is treating them equal, then actually you are not treating them equal. We all have a very personalized experience of where we came from and what we were brought up with. And so for someone to say, well, I don't see color, I see everyone as equal, by saying that, you're actually marginalizing a very large group of people whose experiences have been shaped by the color of their skin, unfortunately. It would be wonderful and idealistic to think that We don't see anybody as any different. You know, the color of their skin does not impact us. And for you, that may be the case. However, for that individual, that is absolutely not the case. So the authors of your textbook really believe that helping professionals who have limited awareness of the significance of race may experience problems in listening empathetically and actually understand client conflicts that are directly related to race. So I urge you, do not wipe away someone's entire experience or their identification or what has impacted their ability to access equal schools or to access equal benefits because you yourself have an idealistic version of what the world should be. Unfortunately, that is not the case. So to wrap up chapter 21, again touching on culturally sensitive practice with LGBT individuals, it's important to know that there are a large set of traumas similar to ethnic minorities that confront individuals who have self-identified as being lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender throughout their lifespan, and it has impacted the way that they've grown up. It's impacted their relationships, not only with friends, but with family members. So many gay and bisexual men and women suffer depression as a result of homophobia that they experience. And again, as we mentioned earlier at the beginning of this lecture, that they have a higher rate of suicide in the population at large. So it's important to develop, especially as we're all getting older, we kind of we come up with our own identity, and it's important to identify the emotional risk that could be impacted and to really look at self-definition, self-acceptance, and disclosure of individuals. So again, so important that we really look at all aspects of individuals who their lives have been impacted by their experience. So we're going to move on to chapter 26. We've spent most of our time on chapter 21, but chapter 26 I'm going to touch on a little bit. I had thought of not lecturing on this chapter and just allowing you to read it, but there are some primary aspects that I really want to focus on as it relates to this chapter. all of this, of course, as we talk about that basic level, is that the impact of our declining middle class and an increase of people in poverty, we've really seen that there's a great deal of data regarding the increases of the absolute number of lower income individuals and the negative impact of poverty. Your author also stated that he believes that well-paying jobs are becoming more and more scarce, and that higher level jobs are being outsourced to foreign countries. So that middle class is really dwindling down. This means that education has a really big influence on creating a large number of middle class Americans that will have less impact, and more highly educated people in our society will find that they can be only employed in jobs for which a lot of times they're overqualified for. So unfortunately, the first group to feel this effect will be older workers, whereas younger workers, and so individuals who are just either coming in college or graduating college, may find that available jobs pay less. And what we're seeing is in each year, we typically see where children do a little bit better financially than their parents, even above kind of that increase in money that's made. Truly, we're finding that this next generation of individuals may be the first generation in hundreds of years that are not doing even as well as their parents, but potentially a little bit lower. And so your author had also mentioned this identification of two Americas, where we have one that's privileged and the other that's overburdened. So one America that does work, and another American that reaps the rewards of those who do work and more play the stock market and have a larger income to be able to have individuals to work underneath them but not pay them as much. And we also, your book talks about one America that pays taxes and another America that is getting very large tax breaks. And then as a counter argument, because again, it's really important that we don't bias ourselves in only believing one individual, they also provided the study that was done by Rector and Herderman in 2004 that reject the idea of two Americans by saying that class warfare has actually always been a mainstay in liberal politics. And if we look back, it's been there the whole time. So some unattended practice issues, and again, as I mentioned, I'm only briefly touching on chapter 26, which is large and robust, and you'll be responsible for all of chapter 26 in your lecture. But I did want to touch on in the last two slides some unattended practice issues for social work. The author believes that social work and social welfare institutions have actually avoided dealing with some very serious problems in America. So again, if you are someone who wants to be a social worker but has this idealized view that racism doesn't exist and discrimination doesn't happen, unfortunately, you may be one of those social workers who are not going to really hit those sensitive issues hard and make a large impact because you do have somewhat of some blinders on. So again, one thing that was pointed out is we see more women are going back to college, fewer men going back to college, and we're seeing that men are actually doing a little bit worse than women these days, but very little is given in the literature or even addressed about male problems, specifically within our social work professional literature. So we really need to talk about that. If you look on the health effects of that, men outrank women in all of the 15 leading causes of death, with the exception of Alzheimer's, and that death rates are twice as high for men as for women's, especially in suicide, homicide, and cirrhosis of the liver. So we as social workers have to do better in working with certain groups and addressing some of these issues. So the future of social work and social welfare, I would even argue, is more positive than what was produced in your book. So the U.S. Department of Labor 7 years ago estimated that employment of social work is projected to grow faster than average for all occupations, and that an average salary for all social workers, and again, I would argue those would be social workers with a bachelor's in social work, are at about $42,000. Caruth also predicted that psychotherapy and counseling will be used less often in their practices as educational approaches, and looking at evidence-based practice and evidence utilized in research, similar to what they do in the medical field, is going to predominate with a focus on prevention. And again, having the social work model look a little bit more like the medical model in that regards. Many social workers are utilizing the internet not only to provide those direct services, but also direct clients as two sources of information that could help them. So that very key aspect that social work does, which is connecting resources to people, may be facilitated better due to our increase in technology. So that was a quick down and dirty 30-minute lecture on chapters 21 and 26. Again, I try to highlight some of those elements in this online class as you do the readings, and so I don't want to go through every point, but it is important to do so. So I hope you enjoy these readings, and again, have an open mind. I know you all have an open heart and you want to see the world in a certain way, but have a very open mind as it relates to really confronting some of those major issues. And have a good week. If you have any questions or are struggling with anything, please give me a call. I really encourage that. So have a great week. We'll talk to you soon.